So again, welcome to module 4, and we're talking about what to pay. And for this module, unlike the others, I'm doing something a little bit different. And mostly the difference is that I'm not kind of going through like a straight PowerPoint like I've done the other ones. There will be a PowerPoint that'll be saved onto the group along with the video by Monday, but I wanted to give you guys just the guts and the meat of creating pay, a little bit of history behind pay, and how you can start creating your pay packages now. So for the time that we're together, that's kind of where I'll put the focus, but there will be a presentation saved onto the group for you guys to kind of thumb through a little bit. As well, I saved onto the group with you guys a sample pay package that I'll talk a little bit about at the very end, but let's get started with this. So a little bit about me and my background. So prior to becoming a nurse, I was a human resources professional that worked with the federal government. So I worked with Department of Transportation, I worked with USDA, I've also worked with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation over the last 12, 15 years before transitioning into nursing. In all my roles there, I worked as a human resources specialist in varying departments. So a big part of how pay packages are created is kind of defining what the pay is, like what's included in the pay. So one, I want to clarify the difference between a pay and compensation. So pay is just the hourly rate that you're receiving for doing a specific job. Compensation includes the hourly rate, your benefits, any sort of retirement, and any sort of merit increases or other perks that you get from working for that particular employer. So as agency owners, for the most part, even though that's something I'll touch on a little bit at the end, we're only offering our employees the pay. So some of the components of the pay that you want to consider, or that are typically considered, is that, the years of experience for this pay, any sort of education or specialized education that's required, or certificates when you talk about healthcare. And then you also want to talk about the location. So those are mostly the components that have been used to create pay within the federal government, and it's also used within other industries as well. In healthcare, there's some variation of it, but that's kind of the things that I want to touch on in this topic today, as well as later on this week, we'll actually look at the calculator. So when you're putting together like a pay package, these are some things you want to consider. You want to consider the experience, not in a way that you're going to adjust the pay so much, because most agencies don't give you more pay for more experience as you would get in a situation if you were working as a staff employee. So I want to kind of make sure that everybody understands that as agency owners, we just don't have the flexibility in pay to give someone who has 10 years so much more money than someone who has 5 years. So all of that plays into it. And that's what you want to factor in, because a lot of people ask the question about moving to other states, and I'm all for it. Growth is great. But if you're going to move to another state, then you also have to make sure that you're able to keep up with the pay of that state. And then the last part for me is the merit increases. So as agency owners, you can give merit increases or loyalty bonuses or different things like that. But what you really want to make sure that you're doing is that you're accounting for it somewhere. You can call them merit increases, loyalty bonuses, you can call them employee referrals, but you want to account or be able to account for it within your budget, within your pay. So a couple of ways to help you with getting started is to do your research. So all of you guys have spoken with me, and we've always talked a lot about research. And one of the things that I encourage you to do when it comes to pay is definitely do your research here to make sure that you're offering the most competitive packages. So there's a couple of different places you can do your research, but these are the places that I've found to provide a little bit more accurate information but I suggest you look at all the places. So it's looking at PayScale, which is a good website to kind of find more information about what's the pay in your area, as well as the second tab you see there is Indeed.com, which also has something similar to this. And then we'll get into this last few slides in a little bit. So everybody, every location kind of has like that base pay that you get, and then you kind of build on top of it. So what makes PayScale really good is that you can look around and see, hey, how much are they paying for different jobs in different industries? As well as when I mentioned base pay, a lot of times your base pay is similar to your median pay, and that's like the average pay for that role. And here, we're going to take a quick look at the registered nurse role and see what the average pay, which looks accurate. So the average pay for registered nurse, and it doesn't really get into specialties just because some of that can be challenging, is about $29, which I think is fair. I think on average that's about right. And a big part of where they get the information from is when people post jobs. So that little blurb you heard, the AI bot goes in and pulls information from employers who post the jobs and post the pay. And that's kind of how they get it from there. They also get information from the Department of Labor. That's how they get information from pay and pull together these averages or these median pays. So, and then this is for the Houston, Texas market. We can change it, so we can change it to, let's do Dallas. I think, I want to say Dallas is more. And as you spend more time, you know, dealing with pay and looking at different pay, you'll see more information about, okay, we don't want to do all that. What's a fair pay or what's like a median pay area. And as nurses yourselves, you should already kind of have an idea of it, but this is a great place to start. Talks about the hourly rate, it talks about the role and responsibilities, and then it kind of also touches on different companies. So it also talks about the different companies and what their average pay is, which is about right. And I want to touch on this because I am a little bit familiar with Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser Permanente pay is a little bit higher than the other ones is because they have a big presence in California. So because they have a big presence in California, their pay looks a little bit higher than other states. And as you guys know, or you may not know, nurses out of California make the highest wage in the U.S. as well as on a per diem or agency basis, they make a higher wage, which also factors in that they also have a higher cost of living in California. So if we go with 29, which works, and I'm going to go ahead and round it up to 30. So if we go with 30 as the baseline, then you want to touch on some of the other pieces that factor in. So if 30 is your base pay or your median pay, what would be some other factors to consider? So you want to kind of consider, is this a specialty? You know, is this like your med-surg tele floor job opening, or is this an ICU ED floor? Because those roles typically have an even higher pay range for those roles because of their specialties. Is it oncology? Is it infusion? Is it OR? Is it a hard to fill? Is it at a teaching hospital? Is it an L-type hospital? So you want to consider all those things. And you don't necessarily have to consider those things in a way to say, oh, well, I need to change the pay from 30 to 50, because that might not be the answer. But you want to be mindful of it when you compare other clients who are different than them. So for instance, the pay that you would give a hospital nurse, RN, should be different than the pay that you would give a long-term care nurse. Now, as I know most of you guys are starting with long-term care nurses, so whenever or if you decide to transition into hospital nursing or staffing for nurses in that role, you already have in mind their pay should be a little bit more. So once you kind of have your baseline pay, then you want to start to consider what's happening in your industry. So you have your baseline pay, you have any sort of specialty pay, any sort of addition to because of a specialty. Then you also have in place location. If you're in a high paying area like a California, New York City, those are some of the locations that I would consider high paying areas. And it's not all of California, I will say that much. And then the last piece is what's going on in the industry. You know, what's happening in the industry and what are other agencies offering. So you want to always know what your competitor is offering. So if, say, this is mine and I'm in Delaware and my competitor, and Delaware is not an expensive state, and my competitor is offering, say they're offering the higher end at 41, okay, that kind of tells me where I need to be. So when I speak about where you need to be, you want to consider your other expenses. So on average, and I think I talked about this a little bit early on, but just in case I didn't, on average, as an agency owner, you want to bill your client 45% to 50% above the pay rate. So if the pay rate is $30, you want to bill at least $60 or more. And that's kind of the industry average. And I think maybe it was in the webinar that I did with Katie, I touched on that was kind of one of the reasons that I transitioned into the other side of healthcare staffing, is because I realized that's what was happening. You know, I realized when I saw an invoice from an employer that they were billing 50% of my pay to that facility for me to go to work. But I was the one doing all the work. So that not only was that the case then, and that's kind of been the standard as I've done research with other agencies, is how it's set up. So once you're able to factor that in, you kind of want to create it in a way where you're giving yourself enough flexibility to say, okay, so the bill rate's going to be $60, right? So you're going to say it's 30. I'm going to do 30 is the average for the area and the role that I'm hiring for. I'm going to do 60 as my bill rate. But before you kind of finalize on that bill rate, you want to factor in a few other things. So some things to consider before you say, hey, 60 is the bill rate. You want to say, am I working with a payroll funding company, which means that a percentage of that bill rate is already being taken away. So the profit to the organization isn't going to be $30, it might be $28 or $25. So in that case, you want to increase your bill rate a little bit more. Is this enough to cover all of my expenses as an operation, meaning your insurances, you know, your state unemployment taxes, your workers' compensation, if you have an office space, you know, if you have computer systems, so, or scheduling systems. So that's also something that you want to factor in when you finalize on your bill rate. Is this going to cover everything? Or, and if it does, what's left over? So you really want to make sure that when you settle on the bill rate, that you kind of take those steps so that you're really able to get a bill rate where you're actually able to make the type of money that you need to sustain yourself and your business over time. So that's a little bit on kind of determining the bill rate there. And we're going to take a quick look at Indeed. And these are all tools you can use to research your bill rates. And as I mentioned before, both PayScale and Indeed actually pull it from when employers post. So they're pulling the information, and Indeed is pretty much in alignment with the other organization. And then, of course, they put the top companies, they touch on, which is kind of nice. So they touch on here on Indeed the differences in like major metropolitan cities, which is what you see here. And for the most part, kind of in general, the way that I look at the pay structure from a skilled nurse and then on the East Coast, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and that Northeast Massachusetts area also has higher than normal pay rates, bill rates, both. Then when you go into the Mid-Atlantic, it's kind of somewhere in the middle, and the Midwest is somewhere in the middle. But traditionally, the Southeast, which for me would be North Carolina, any place south, Tennessee, South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, up to Texas, has lower than average pay rates. And then Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona are usually somewhere in the middle. And then the middle states, it can vary a little bit. But that's kind of how I've been able to map out the states from my experiences, and I kind of seen that consistently. Part of the reason that Washington State, Oregon, and California have higher than normal pay rates for long-term care or bill rates is because they also have quite a union presence. And in states that have a union presence, typically you get a little bit more because you have to follow a contract. And then that also applies for some of the Northeast states, upper Northeast, but also in the upper Northeast, like Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, they have higher rates also because it's colder. So it's harder to fill those needs. And you'll also see that in states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho, Iowa. So states where it gets like super, super cold and it becomes hard to fill roles is where they'll bump the rates up a little bit more so. And then kind of the Southeast is ideal weather, it's warmer weather, and traditionally the rates have been lower than average. But that doesn't mean that your agency can't make money. So I don't want you guys to get that perception. It's just been the case. And then it also displays here a little bit from the highest paying cities in the United States. So you see Dallas and Miami are a little bit lower, Atlanta, and then you see Philly, New York, Phoenix. Not sure about Phoenix, but Houston and Chicago are a little bit more. So it's kind of showing a little bit of that there. And I'm gonna go ahead and link it here. If you guys want to take a look at it, do now later. So I'm gonna link both of these for you guys to check out. And then this is also a great resource because it kind of shows where registered nurses earn more. And we touched on this. So this is kind of the map that I talked about not too long ago. And it kind of says a lot of what I was saying. So like this is Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Maine, this area, Vermont, so this area, New York, and then West Virginia. I haven't done too much work in West Virginia, but kind of this Southeast corridor is a little bit less. And then Texas, New Mexico kind of fits in the middle. And then of course, California, Nevada, and Oregon and Washington are a little bit higher. And then these are like your middle states where it's kind of somewhere in the middle as well. So that's a good thing to know. And then of course, this is Alaska. So Alaska, of course, and Hawaii are because they're off of the mainland. They also have higher cost of living. So I would only get into those contract opportunities with clients if they were exclusive contracts that you knew people were interested in going, just because there may or may not be able to be made there a tremendous amount of money, but there are destination paces for a lot of travelers. So if you get into the travel thing, a lot of people will want to travel to Hawaii and Alaska. But from a financial standpoint of view, it may or may not be worth it, but it's definitely something worth looking into. Okay. So this kind of touches on a few other things. So I spoke earlier about pay, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about creating the package. So initially, I recommend people, you don't have to offer benefits and things of that nature. So for the most part, and this was based on, which will probably change as we go into next year, if you don't have more than 50 employees working for your organization, you don't have to offer medical insurance. But if it's something that you would like to offer or offer over time, there is, through the Affordable Care Act, there is an option for small businesses to offer insurances. I will say it is quite expensive. But there are other things that you can offer to them that are of value and things that I would incorporate in a compensation package that may be beneficial to your employees. And a couple of things would be some of the options that you get through your AFLAC programs. A lot of employers offer those. So you can easily get access to those and offer those benefits where you can get short-term disability or long-term disability or some sort of dental insurance. So those are things that you can offer to your employee that's not a high cost for the employer. Some other types of benefits that you can offer include your licensure reimbursement. You can definitely offer that. You can offer paid time off in some capacity. You can offer trips. I know one organization, after working so many hours, it's usually thousands of hours with the organization, they have like a free trip, or you can offer that as a day off. Like after 1,000 hours working, you get one paid day off. So there's a lot of different ways to offer benefits to your employees that don't include like your traditional medical, dental, vision, life insurance package that is not as costly to you as a employer, as a small business employer. Of course, your free training, certifications, you get paid for CPR classes and things of that nature. If they go back and get specific CEUs that make them more marketable, those are definitely things that you can do as well. So I'm just going to go down and see what else we got here. But as you start to create your packages, this is something to consider, and mostly because of these times. And one of the things that you want to consider is that the COVID rates. So what I suggest people to do is create within your contract a hazard pay. So it could be a percentage, or it could be a specific amount, like it might be $5, and that's up to you, like what you feel is fair. But understand that as we go into 2021 and COVID and the vaccines here and different things like that are taken care of, most facilities and hospital systems will no longer accept that hazard pay. So I tell people not to put your rate up so high that at the point that COVID-19 is kind of quote unquote controlled, you can no longer sustain your employees. So if you say the same employees that you said you're billing for $60, you put a $10 or $20 hazard pay on top of it, and you're billing $80, you really have to be mindful of that. Your employees need to know. There has to be an understanding. You need to know that at some point in 2021, everybody's going back down to that $60 bill rate. So you really want to run your business in that way. So any hazard pay monies that you were getting previously, which are great, it's usually a mutually beneficial thing. But you want to make sure that it's temporary. So you want to have accounted for it or have a place for it within your budget. And I tell people, once you kind of set the budget or set the pay for that particular role or that particular facility, as time goes on, you can increase the pay or have a, special rate if they have, for last minute situations, but note that there's probably a low to unlikelihood that we'll go back to those COVID rates that we saw where, in my opinion, if an employee was making $100, the agency was billing $300, just because those monies were mixed in monies. They just usually weren't monies from the facility, coming from the facility. Some other things to think about when you talk about skilled nursing facilities are licensed practical nurses. So we talked a little about the registered nurses, and really the same formula applies for licensed practical nurses and certified nursing assistants. The main difference is the numbers of it all. So you want to make sure that, hey, if you're going to do 50%, that you're doing it for all three areas, or if you decide to do a specific amount of money, which is another option to say, hey, as long as we profit $15 per hour on every nurse that we staff, that's a way to do it as well. But you just want to make sure that you're maintaining that consistency. So on here, another example, it says licensed practical nurses make on average $26, and that's probably about right in the US. Let's take a quick look. So with the licensed practical nurses, they are some limitations in the settings that they work in. Certain states, they can still work in hospital settings, but that's something to be mindful of. But if we say, for instance, with the licensed practical nurse, we say, okay, so they're making $28 on average, and then we want to bill the facility. I had to pull out my calculator again. We want to bill the facility $56. So, and then $60 or $62 for the registered nurses, which are fair rates. And when I say fair, that's kind of where we were when we first got started. That was fair rates for New Mexico. And what I would suggest you do is also look at some of the job boards on social media and Indeed and different platforms to see what they're billing as well. When I say look at them for research purposes, it's not to compare what you're offering, it's just to see what's out there. So you want to make sure that if we say we're going to give our licensed practical nurses $28, that in our same state, in our same area, working within that same specialty, they're not giving them $38. And then you're kind of putting yourself in a place of, oh, well, why can't I get any nurses to work for me? So that's why the research piece really in all of the modules is really key, because you can kind of answer your own question. So if you hadn't looked around and saw what other agencies are doing, then you might put yourself in a position where you can't staff a particular role because your bill rate is too low, your pay rate is too low. Not so much your bill rate. Rarely will your bill rate be too low, but your pay rate is too low, or that your bill rate is too high. Well, you can't get clients because you're billing too high. You want to bill $100 an hour for a licensed practical nurse. For a COVID situation, that's possible, but as time goes on, like I mentioned before, COVID will go away. That's not really feasible. So that's a little bit about, kind of thinking about your pay, creating your pay. And I'm going to actually go into so I'm going to go ahead and jump into the post that I put onto the group earlier this week. So I stopped sharing. And if you're just joining, I am recording this, so all of the saved on to the presentation to do a little bit. I've done some of the other presentations where I'm going to talk a little bit, and when I finish talking, which will be shortly, you guys can kind of ask your questions, and I'll answer them. And then by tomorrow, all of the video, audio, and questions will be saved onto the group. So this is more of a Q&A to kind of give you guys the opportunity to ask questions. So I'm going to jump into the group really quickly and open up the post that I did earlier with the 2 different agencies' pay packages. So give me a second. And then that'll kind of be the end for me, and then I'll give you guys the opportunity to ask your questions. As well, there will be another session this coming week just to show you guys the calculator. So I didn't want to put too much information in one session, so I just wanted to kind of just talk about the pay and things that you want to consider, and then go into the actual calculator a little bit later on in the week. Okay. Okay, that should be fine. Excuse me. Okay, so I'm going to share again. So you guys should see this post. I put this post already in the group earlier this week before we started talking about pay. So let me know if you can see it or if you can't see it. So Yolanda, I think, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to do this and then I'll go through some of the questions. So you guys should see this post. So it kind of talks about the standard agency and then the Nurse Pro agency. And the reason I posted this is just because this kind of gets people thinking. And the main things that you want to kind of consider when you're creating your bill rates is how the package looks for you and how it looks for your applicants. So as I mentioned before, this is what it has here is pretty accurate, the standard agency, not so much the bill rate as much as how it's broken down. So it could be 60, 50, the actual bill rate can be whatever number, but the agency fee, meaning the percentage of that bill rate that the agency keeps, is pretty accurate. So for this instance, they're keeping 56%, which is about your $39.20, and then they're paying the nurse $30. And then this just kind of talks about paying the nurse weekly and annual income, and then the nurse is paid every 2 weeks. And then the other example, they're only taking 30%, which is pretty on the lower end. So between 30 and 56%. It just kind of depends on how the agency is set up. And a lot of this depends on whether or not they're an agency that's doing payroll funding, self-funding, an agency owner. So all those things kind of factor in as to why this agency decided to take 30% instead of 56% or 50% in this case. But of course, we see by them taking 30%, they're paying their nurse much higher. They're also paying out the nurse weekly, which is pretty much the standard. And then, of course, our annual income is more. So setting up your rates, something similar to this, is beneficial to you so that you can always know how much you're going to get. I will say I do prefer the percentage formula where you're taking 30% of 70 or 56% of 70 of your bill rate versus some other formulas that people use, but it's up to you as to what you feel is best. As long as you're making sure that you're meeting all of your business operational costs, which is kind of the main idea behind it. And any fees, any fees that you may pay a vendor management system, you may pay a payroll funding company, that you're also incorporating that into your bill rate. So I'm going to open it up for some questions, and then I'm going to touch just a little bit on the travel pay, as some of you guys have asked about the travel pay, but it'll make a little bit more sense when I go over the payroll calculator. But I did want to touch a little bit on travel pay as well. So if you have any questions, go ahead and you can jump in and ask a question, or you can drop it in the chat box. So feel free, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about travel pay and just this portion of it, just so it helps people kind of understand the per diem and the meals and incidental breakdown. So, and I'm going to drop this. So every year, the federal government creates a per diem highlight, so they create an overview of per diem rates, which is essentially your meals and incidentals, expenses, and housing rates. And those rates are based on mostly individuals who travel. Is kind of with the idea of individuals who travel for the federal government, or military people who travel, which is also federal government, so that they'll be paid a certain amount of money for working outside of their home state. So a couple of things to remember or consider when you expand your business to include travelers. So there's just two types of pays for me. Either you're paying them as a local person or you're paying them as a travel. But in order to meet the qualifications as a traveler, within healthcare, the notion has been that you have to be 50 miles away from your home. And that's not actually accurate. You don't have to be 50 miles away from your home. So the idea of that has been a practice within healthcare where where they've done it that way, and then recruiters and other individuals have kind of repeated it. But this, under the GSA website, is actually giving you like information, policies, and a lot more resources about that and how to use it, just because not everybody is eligible for the meals and incidentals, expenses, and housing rates, which essentially the benefit to employees is that they're not being taxed. So as a local employee, you'll get taxed the full W-2 everything. But as a traveler, you'll only be taxed a portion of your bill rate. So the bill rate that we saw earlier, the $30 an hour, many times you can pull that out and then kind of break it down into these different pieces for travelers who are traveling away from home. And what I tell people is, if you're not working with genuinely travelers, don't introduce this. Because not only do they have to meet specific requirements and sign affidavits saying that they're indeed, at a different residence, you also have to meet those as too, saying that you actually verified this. So to kind of give it more information, when you see the postings where they say, oh, your meals and incidentals, or they also call them per diem, which is really not, it's your meals and incidentals and expenses, this is where they're getting that number from. So this is for the 2021 year, and this is kind of how they're getting that number. And all of it's based on where you're located. So there is a locator where you go in and you search, and then it'll show you the rates. So let's do 20740. And what this really says is that as an employer, or in this case, the federal government, I can pay up to this amount of money because my employee is away from home. So this is the actual full amount here. And then this breaks it down per item. So it's the $76, the continental breakfast up to, and a lot of this is based on a person actually providing you with receipts. So that's why you see it broken down so much, but you don't have to, you don't have to. And then you get paid up the rates from. So this is from, okay, this is up until this year. So as you can see, the rates will change depending on the time of year. Like in the winter, spring months, there's a lot higher than the fall, winter months. And it's essentially one available for every state. There are some states that won't have the per diem breakdown. And for those states, I'm just going to put West Virginia, because I do know West Virginia is one of those states. They'll have a, let's see. They'll have a flat across the board rate. So there's certain cities and states that don't have a per diem lodging rate. They'll have just a flat rate that will apply as well. Let's see. Try it again. Okay. So the same thing, you'll see the breakdown, and then they'll break down the city. So it's called the standard rate, applies for all locations without specified rate. So if you try to look up your city and state and it comes up as a standard rate, there are quite a few states where it's just a standard rate no matter the time of year. Which looks a lot different than what we saw when we looked up DC. So I don't want to spend too much time on that. I just wanted to share that with you guys a little bit, since I know many of you all are thinking about expanding into other states. Okay, you got a question. Jennifer asked, do you recommend focusing on one state first or multiple states, since we have double owners in different states? So I would focus on one state first, with kind of a timeline to get into the next state. And kind of the reason I would focus on one state is because it's not to say that, like, you can get into the first state and it may not be any, you know, it may be a state that's saturated, but you want to kind of have everything in place so that as you transition to the next state, because each state runs, you know, the business will run a little bit differently, you'll kind of already be prepared. So that you can kind of create a model, have systems in place, have, you know, resources and how you're going to run the business already set up. And then when you enter, like if you want to enter Texas and Mississippi, or you wanted to do Florida, you already know that process and that market, so that you're not kind of jumping into another state where there's no, you know, you may be having some of the challenges that you had before. So I would definitely do one state at a time, to give yourself enough time to do research on that state and make sure it's a good fit. Any other questions? So kind of like I mentioned earlier, I am going to do the calculator. So the calculator and all of that will drop this week in a video, kind of how you can use it. Will drop as well. How you can use it for your business. I know a lot of you guys are working into the second and third modules and wrapping up those things along the way.